far. Just in terms of making sure that I'm moving quickly through this conversation, the reason that I'm here talking to you tonight is that I don't say this with any sort of pride, it's just the reality that I am the staff person in the city of Boulder that worked on municipalization the very longest. And I'll give you a little bit of the timeline around that. So I want to thank Randy. He and I know each other as we were going through our early process. We reached out to the best and brightest minds that either had succeeded or had lessons to learn around municipalization, Randy being one. He mentioned ENCO, another group that we worked with. One of your callers earlier mentioned Jefferson County. We talked with those folks. And so I think doing what you're doing is incredibly important, hearing the stories. So I really want to thank all of you commissioners for taking up this really important issue. And I want to thank all of your callers and everybody that's watching this meeting. This is a really important issue that you are addressing, no doubt about it. I was really struck with the comments by many of your callers. They sound incredibly familiar from going through this process for over a decade. I also want to thank my colleagues, Paul Koehn and Steve Whitaker, who both called in. They are two of our incredibly bright and very, very passionate members of our community who served on working groups over the duration of our municipalization effort. Okay, so the hardest part, I think, for me tonight is to be succinct. So after a decade of this project and literally hundreds of presentations on municipalization, town halls, council conversations, we have a lot of material. So it was difficult for me to kind of condense this down into telling a story for you tonight. And that's what I'm going to do. I want to tell you a story. And it is a story of Boulder's exploration to create our own locally owned and operated electric utility. I'm going to jump to the spoiler because you heard it earlier that in July of last year and last November, the city of Boulder did reach a settlement with Xcel Energy that includes a franchise agreement along with a partnership agreement. And that facilitates our ability to participate in electrical system planning, collaboration on projects, and really a commitment to work together to achieve our city's goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and some scalability. So the impact that Xcel is having here in the state of Colorado. As I said, the community voted to enter into the franchise on November 3rd. I'm going to get back to the points in the guts of that agreement, but I want to come back to a point here. Make no mistake, I am not telling a cautionary tale. As Paul Koehn mentioned, that we did make mistakes and you can learn from those mistakes, no doubt about it. I get asked this question a lot. Was it worth it? Would you do it all over again? And my answer every single time is emphatically yes. And we as a community established a series of community-based energy goals. We never went into this process with the intention really to own and operate a local utility. Our goal was not to own wires and poles and to be the utility. It was about achieving our goals as a community. And that's a theme I want to keep coming back to because it's a really important one. I will share, it'll become obvious that I am a firm believer in public power. All right, I want to start, if possible, and I'm going to tempt my technological fate here. I want to try to show a video. And the video is a little outdated, but I think it's an important one. We have a number of materials out there that kind of tell this story, but this is one that really emphasizes the importance of value. And I think it really emphasizes the importance of the fight that comes with municipalization. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to do my best. And if for some reason this doesn't work, it's okay. I have a PowerPoint that we'll go right to. So bear with me for just a second, the awkward pause. I'm going to share my sound and I am going to just ask, let's see who I can see on my screen. Chairman, do you see a YouTube?
I do see the whole YouTube screen, yep. And if you go full screen, then we should be in good shape.
Great.
Fires are blowing up all over Colorado, growing to about 8,000 acres in a matter of hours, as many as 60 structures.
To the National Climatic Data Center last year, the warmest on record for the United States, going back 118 years.
Other disasters carried more than $1 billion price tag, including...
This is a story about something that's happening in every community across America, and what one community is doing to fight back. This is a story about democracy, about David versus Goliath, about our planet and health, versus corporate greed. This is a story that might just be the shot across the bow for how our society finally addresses climate change. It all started with a local community that created a landmark opportunity to create a new energy model to be applied in cities across the country. It's a model that addresses the root cause of climate change, and it's happening here in Colorado.
2011, the city of Boulder voted to localize its power supply. First city in the country to do so for the sole purpose of reducing its impact on the planet.
We voted to become a locally owned municipal utility so that we could make our energy decisions right here at home.
Our electricity is predominantly produced in coal-fired plants.
Our community has one of the most carbon-intensive fuel supplies in the country. We already know where scientists say we need to be to even begin making a difference, but we also know that we are not on a path to get there anytime soon. After many frustrating years of trying to reach our energy reduction goals by working with our existing monopoly utility, Xcel Energy, we learned just how broken our country's energy infrastructure is, all because of just a handful of huge corporations that stand in the way of change. So we decided to create a model for how a community, any community, can take real action against climate change by phasing out fossil fuels and transitioning to a grid dominated by renewable energy. Xcel spent $1 million on a well-orchestrated fear campaign, but a committed group of community advocates and a small nonprofit that gets youth engaged in politics won the day. Outspent 10-1, the Grassroots Coalition registered voters, knocked on doors, and made thousands of phone calls. So David beat Goliath, for now.
And then a third-party reviewer has come in and looked at that complete package and said Boulder has done an excellent job at studying this, better than most communities that these third-party reviewers work with.
And they found out that they could get there. Cleaner, cheaper, and quicker on their own. So with this news, Goliath reemerged. And this time, Xcel Energy is flooding our community with even more money.
Boulder once again is facing a massive amount of corporate influence on our community.
They're funding a ballot measure that aims to undo our community's work, confusing residents and businesses with outright lies. And they're preparing to spend whatever it takes. This is a textbook example of how corporations attempt to influence our democracy, election after election. No, seriously, they have a textbook. There's a lot on the line here for Xcel. Not only are they defending the $35 million in profit they make off of Boulder each and every year, but they know that Boulder is on the verge of setting an important precedent. A precedent that has national significance and could threaten not just Xcel Energy, but the very core of the business model and the billions in profits that come with it of the dirty coal energy industry. If Boulder is successful, we'll show the country that with local control, a community can put their values into action. That when a community isn't reliant on an outdated corporate structure for their energy, they can not only power their community off renewable energy, but it can be done better and cheaper. And if we can do it, maybe other communities will start wondering what the millions in profits they pay to their power provider could do in their city. And in fact, communities are already starting to do just that. And that would be a symbolic defeat Xcel just can't have. If we win, we trigger a national model that can be replicated across the country. But the only way David beats Goliath this time is with your help. Because the only way to counter money is with people. We need to run a truly sophisticated grassroots campaign that will expose Xcel for what they are, a huge corporation looking to buy an election in order to protect their profits. We need to hire organizers that can recruit volunteers to mobilize our community, both online and off. We need the resources to get the real message out. We did it last time, but this time is going to be a fight our community has never seen. They might have the war chest, but we have the army, and we are here to recruit you. Right now, more than ever, we need you. Your financial support will help restore our community's voice.
actually going to stop it there, and I'm going to shift my share. And that was a little abrupt. I apologize for that. I want to shift now. And the reason that I showed that video, and Chairman, could you also now tell me if there is a PowerPoint slide?
It is, but
Thank
not
you.
full screen yet. Yep.
Got it. I will do that. I cannot believe I got that right. It's a miracle.
After all those
Okay.
hundreds, you're getting good.
Okay, well, the reason that I wanted to share that video with all of you is that was a series of campaigns that, I'm so sorry, just get rid of that. A series of campaigns that led up to a number of votes that we have. So we won that vote. We won the second vote, and we won subsequent votes here in the city of Boulder. Now, the story has changed in terms of our relationship to our utility provider, but that macro view of our energy economy has not. And I want that to be the backstop for your conversation in your community to understand what it is you're really up against. Randy said it well. Municipalization is hard. It is expensive, but in the end, it provides great value. And it's whether or not that value is right for your community, I think, is what's most important. So I want to just go through some slides with you that will hopefully answer some of your questions that I saw proposed, and we'll just kind of crank through these as quickly as I can. So we started out our municipalization effort. Look at, I am messing up all over now. Really thinking about how we identify local power. And that is, of course, you heard a lot about municipalization, but it's our effort to bring clean, local, affordable, and reliable electricity to our communities. So when we talk about our energy goals, they are really underpinned by opportunities to create a robust energy economy, more control of our energy supply and investments and services that meet our community's needs, how we provide value and access for everyone. There were a lot of discussions in your callers' comments about equity. How do we provide innovation opportunities for technology at competitive costs that balance short and long-term needs? How do we create a reliable, secure, and resilient energy system? A safe energy supply that's protected against external threats. So as we began our effort really in earnest back in 2007, that was our first opportunity to negotiate with our incumbent utility around our franchise. And after several years of negotiating, that's where I became involved. It was pretty clear that our utility was not really thinking about a new agreement or partnership agreement. It was really to contain or continue with a relationship that's a buyer-seller relationship. And so for us, we wanted to be treated as customers and as equals in thinking about our energy future. So the local power project really began in earnest in 2010, and that was to examine options that could provide Boulder residents and businesses with electricity that's increasingly clean, reliable, and competitively priced. We learned a lot across this journey. The project was largely focused on municipalization as that pathway for achieving the goals. And of course, it involved a lot of litigation matters between the city and Xcel. So think about the choices that we had at the time. Really, of course, it was to stay with Xcel under what was called our status quo option, which is to continue with no franchise. In 2010, our council, after our urging as a staff team, agreed to allow our franchise to expire, allowing that franchise fee to expire. And I'll come back to that in terms of the essential funding necessary for this project. So again, Xcel is obligated to continue to provide the level of service that they were, and we could function indefinitely without a franchise. We could continue to focus on things like demand side management, options as they become available, and things that are really in the margins. And that's really was not compatible with our community's desires to really be innovative. We also could look at ways to create a new franchise agreement with Xcel. And over the decade, we had multiple fits and starts of working groups with Xcel, new opportunities to partner, writing white papers about what we were seeking. Or as we presented to our council, we could actually create a municipal utility that owns or operates the distribution system. So I won't go through this, you know all this. One thing that I would flag is that it's a very interesting phenomenon when in Colorado we have 29 munis already. So the question then became of what would be different if our peer communities around the state can own and operate a utility. Why couldn't we? We generally feel like we're fairly smart people. The difference, of course, is that being able to shift from being served by an investor-owned to a muni, and the cost and the legal challenges that brings. And so of those 29, all were set up originally in that form. So municipalization became a really big challenge, and it represented change. And so that really was the piece that our utility grabbed a hold of: delay and change, and the risk that might come with that. So as we went through some of our initial conversations as a community, we really started to lay out some charter requirements that followed this pattern: how we think about the 3Ds: decarbonize, decentralize, and democratize our energy, and really pin our work around rates, reliability, and renewables. So this is a little bit of a blurry slide, but just gives you a sense of some of the timeline. I won't go through this. This is all publicly available. But I do want to highlight some really important things that we've had a number of votes. First in 2011, again in 2015, 2017, and then again in 2019. One of the big issues that I already flagged is the loss of revenues from our franchise fee. So one of the first votes that we actually did is create a fairly elegant solution to replace those funds by creating what was called the utility occupation tax. Our ability to tax our utility provider to do business in the city, and it was an algorithm basically to collect the same amount of money from their customers as they were under a franchise fee. Those funds were then remitted to the city, and that's what we use to fund our legal, technical, and financial work to make sure that we were doing our feasibility analysis adequately. So I won't go through this just for sake of time, but just shows some of the votes and some of the margins on those votes. But you can see this has been a grassroots-led effort from the beginning. That video was one of dozens of videos that were put out by many of our incredibly bright and dedicated community members. So they are the ones that in fact drive these campaigns. And so this was never about the city or local government. Our job and role was to make sure that we were making smart choices and that we had all the information presented to our elected officials in our community that they could have informed votes. And so campaigns on both sides of the issue, for and against municipalization, have really ensued over the entire decade or process of the project. So I won't read through this, but there are some key pieces that I wanted to flag, and I think you probably know these. These are the 5 chunks of work that we identified in our, essentially our roadmap. So first, and this is really hard for you to read, I realize that, understanding the regulatory context. Paul mentioned earlier in his call about things that we got wrong. And I think one of those is really understanding the role of the regulators. While the city has the constitutional right in Colorado to actually acquire the system, there's no clear pathway. Just as you heard from Randy, there is no roadmap on how this actually plays out. What is the role of the Public Utilities Commission? In the state of Colorado, Xcel Energy serves the predominant number of customers. And so we have a Public Utilities Commission that essentially oversees one regulated monopoly. And so understanding where and when they fit in was really critical. And the sequence of when you go to your regulators, when you go to FERC, when you might go to your district court for condemnation. And we sequenced those things incorrectly. We thought that we could go to district court first. The PUC came back and said, no, you need to come to us first. And so the impact of that is delay. It's time. And in this case, time was absolutely money. We have a finite amount of funds to get this project done, and any delay just really burnt our capital. So understanding the regulatory context is really, really important. The second piece is planning. So when we think about what we need to do in terms of a transition plan, that was really important. We developed roughly a 600-item work plan. And we know the things that need to get done aren't rocket science, but you need to know how to do them. So this kind of pushes back to this idea that cities don't know how to run a utility because you've never done it. Well, we run a water, stormwater, and wastewater utility with over $1 billion of assets. We know how to run utilities, and we would hire the right people to run an electric utility. So, but that was one of the criticisms, that we had never done it, which is completely fair. So that work plan was to really lay out, how do we get from here to the point that we can stand up a utility? Third is the acquisition. One of your callers earlier referenced the idea that acquisition doesn't have to take a lot of time. I wish that was the case, but that was only in the instance that you have a willing seller. And in our case, Xcel Energy is not interested, nor were they interested in selling the distribution system to the city. So that meant that we had to file regulatory actions to move towards acquiring the system using our condemnation power. And so that's where there was this asymmetry between the regulators and the district court in terms of when and how we actually do the inventory of the assets, value those assets, and go to the district court for condemnation. Fourth is more the technical. How do we separate? How do we do the construction of the facilities in order to take what was once one distribution system and now create two distribution systems? What does that look like, and how do you do it? So hiring electrical engineers, knowing that the utility, the incumbent utility, is going to push back on any costs associated with new metering or new infrastructure, how you deal with the substations, all really critical parts of the technical part of your analysis. And then fifth, I put this on there. This is a really important one. We had to, throughout this entire thread, make sure that we remained really focused on the end goal, which is creating the utility of the future. Our fear was we could get through this and just replicate what we have today. So in terms of the ability to really implement the utility future and say, here's how the city-run utility will look different than it does today. That, I think, is really the sweet spot. So what does it look like to create a marketplace for energy services? How do we create a space where we allow innovation to occur? How do we continue to kind of marry this idea that a utility has to deliver a service, a safe and reliable service, with this new innovation and issues related to climate? So that was really, I think, an important piece. And I would just say, Missy, if I need to wrap up, please tell me, just jump in, because I could do this all night. Okay.
You're doing great.
All right, thank you. All right, so I wanted to get into quickly, that's why I rushed through that. I know a lot of your interest is around feasibility. So I would just say feasibility is not a one-time thing. Feasibility needs to take place throughout your process of creating and standing up a local electric utility, because things change. You learn new things as you go. So originally, we had done a very, very preliminary feasibility analysis in 2005, just looking at, is this something that is even possible? What would it look like? And that was an R.W. Beck study also. We spent about $50,000 on that. We had an energy committee that really scoped that out. And that helped us get our footing underneath us moving into that franchise negotiation. So in 2011, we really moved into feasibility in a really big way. So what you're looking at is a screenshot from a Prezi this was a public presentation, and it was on our website, so people could explore the parts and pieces of our feasibility analysis. And I want to give you the guts of this thing, first of all. So it started with a load model, really understanding what our existing and future load is. That's really important as you start to think about the resources necessary to meet that load requirement. So this is, again, hard to see. I apologize. I'll send you a copy of this slide so you can see this. Then we used a resource model to really optimize resources. This is a piece of software called Homer. It actually was developed here in Boulder. It was developed for NREL to really optimize your system towards the type of output or resources that you want to prioritize. So we have options that look at low cost with some amount of renewables, no coal, local generation. It includes all of the cost of those resources. So you input the load model into the resources, then you have your outputs optimized for, the type of scenario that you'd be seeking. That all gets put into a financial model and allows us to put in additional costs. So things like your stranded acquisition costs, your capital costs, your program and innovation costs, operation and maintenance, transmission costs, your open access transmission tariff for those resources utilizing the system. All of that then created outputs that we ran through a secondary piece of software that, and this is all staff. I should say this up front. This is staff supported by roughly 14 community-based working groups with an incredible amount of expertise. The decision analysis was really an interactive opportunity to look at uncertainty. This is really important. Some people use Monte Carlo analyses. This was our opportunity to really understand where are the high impact variables. Is it your bond rating, for example, your interest rates? What about stranded costs? What are some ranges that we might consider and how might we mitigate those? So that decision analysis was really important to come up with some results that really allowed us to look at rates, our finances, our reliability indices, our climate impact and renewables, and give our community a sense of what feasibility looks like. So one important piece here too, I want to just stress, feasibility is not just looking at whether or not you can do it from a technical, legal, and financial standpoint, but it should answer the question, should you? Not just can you, but should you? Does it provide adequate value beyond where you are today? And that was something that we started with in terms of working at our community-based goals. How do we get there? What does it look like? And how does our utility support those overall goals? So that can we versus should we is something that was really important to us as we went through. I just talked about the decision analysis. This is a little bit of a zoom in on that screen. You can see some of the diagrams that we had out to our community and what the results actually meant. And then this is a screenshot again of some of the results. This is the early modeling. Okay, couple things here, and then I want to get to some of your comments. First, as we started thinking about, I guess maybe these are some of the conclusions. Early on, we really developed a clear set of metrics, and those metrics were embedded within our city charter. So that meant that to guide the creation of electric utility, we had to meet the metrics related to rates, operation, renewables, carbon, cost, and reliability. That was really important. So we set that foundation to say, if we can't meet these metrics, then we should not go forward with creating an electric utility. That was an important piece of our work early on. Second, the financial modeling. So I talked about the early modeling. This is an area that you need to really keep moving throughout the duration of your project to make sure that as things are updated, costs are continually input into this model and the financial feasibility is updated on a regular basis. So one of the things that we did do, and this is available online, I'd be happy to share all of this with you, is we created a financial forecast tool. And you see a screenshot on the right. This is the cover of that tool. It's roughly a 100-page document. This is a user's guide. And what we did is allow our community members to go into this spreadsheet and change those toggles. If someone said, oh, you'll never get that interest rate in terms of your taxable bonds, well, go into the model and move those sliders where you think it fits. And it allows our community to understand financial feasibility and what that might look like. And if they didn't believe that what we were putting in there in terms of bounds was accurate, that they could question that. But it was a great process to really kind of create that financial forecast tool. I think Steve Whitaker, one of the callers, mentioned that our community members continue to utilize this forecast tool moving forward into this last vote that we had. So that financial forecasting is really important. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we really did start to function as a utility early on. And that was because of the recognition that power supply was over 50% of our annual debt service. So yes, we knew that purchasing fully depreciated poles and wires maybe wasn't the best use of funds. We thought about it as really buying our freedom, but really what are the most impactful variables? Power supply was by far the biggest one. So we went out to bid. We actually put out an RFP twice. And we treated it as if we were a utility today, what kind of full requirements offerings could you provide to the city of Boulder? And I will tell you, it was extraordinary to see the kind of bids that we were getting. This answers the question or the criticism that we're not big enough to get the kind of buying power that Excel, who operates in 7 states, might get. Well, we were able to put that to rest and recognize that our ability to achieve those kind of prices was there. We had bidders willing and ready to do full requirements or partial requirements offerings, really innovative portfolios, including battery storage, and then some non-power supply options that would look at operating the utility and thinking about some of our other opportunities around ecosystems management in terms of climate. So I won't go into this, but all of this material is available on our website, all of the responses and a summary of those responses. I think it's really important to do this kind of work too. All right, and so this was some of the results of that power supply scenario. We looked at scenarios around 100% Xcel Energy, looking at 3 years of Xcel, then high renewables, day one high renewables, and you can see that cost average of those responses. Now, I want to hover here for just a second, and I know I'm going a little bit long. One of the reasons that we actually mapped out a 100% renewable, or excuse me, Xcel Energy portfolio, first of all, that's our baseline. The 3-year Xcel, then high renewables, was a scenario that we came up with to mitigate stranded cost. And we can talk about that if you'd like to more, but one of the elegant solutions that we worked with our regulators on is to think about the fact that, in terms of the utility being able to claim stranded cost, they have to prove that they cannot sell that excess generation that would be released or stranded by Xcel leaving the system. They have to prove that they can't sell that capacity to native load customers. And so we follow very closely and participate in Xcel's electric resource plans. And when they come out with their load forecast, we came out with a scenario that said we can gradually depart. We can use that scenario to mitigate stranded cost. As Xcel needs new capacity, we release capacity. We're only 4% of their sales in Colorado, so it's not a huge amount. So we created this gradual departure plan to essentially say we may not be able to get to 100% renewables on day one, but we could balance, maybe pay some stranded cost or wean ourselves off over, say, a 5-year period. And so that was one of the mitigating strategies that we started to explore and wanted to understand what the impact would be in terms of cost if we chose that power supply option. So in summary, the last tool update demonstrated that we absolutely could operate a local electric utility. And in terms of promising financial feasibility, we would see positive cash flow on day one, even with that debt service to pay off that annual debt. And of course, it's not surprising that the most expensive of our scenarios would occur if we bought 100% of our power from Xcel over 10 years. Okay, so a couple of things that are cautionary. Again, I mentioned this earlier. How we navigated the legal and regulatory ground was, again, there was no roadmap. This was a really, really challenging part of our work because, again, the incumbent utility, they can wield their power to throw lawsuits and roadblocks. While those lawsuits eventually were overturned and we won, again, more delay. And that meant that we had to go back to our voters to get more money to continue the feasibility analysis and to continue the work that was necessary to finish the project. Really important, won't go into this in detail, but we had a very, very strong communications and engagement strategy. This was about making sure that our community understood the questions that were being asked and answered, making sure that they had access to the data and understand that they needed to be engaged in asking these critical questions, because at the end of the day, we needed to make sure this was right for our community. I talked about the transition planning and really understanding what it looked like to do the actual technical work to stand up. That included the engineering plans and the schematics to actually separate the system. I mentioned earlier about the work plan. Again, don't look at this. This will make your eyes hurt. Just a screenshot of one of our portion of our work plan. Mentioned again the separation of the systems. Here is our distribution system. We are not very different from Ann Arbor. We're about 27 square miles, about 107,000 in population, a university, some large anchor energy users like the federal labs. So somewhat similar in terms of an overall snapshot of the communities. And then on the right is what it looked like after we did our separation. We have lots of detailed engineering all the way down to every single feeder that would show how we would actually do the separation. And then I mentioned this also, just making sure that we were demonstrating innovation and commitment to clean energy and that utility of the future. All right, we can come back to this, but I wanted to get to this partnership piece. And again, I'll try to go fast. So fast forward, all sounds great, and enter the world of COVID. Now, why I raise this specter is that everything really had to come to a little bit of a delay in terms of the work that was going on. So as I mentioned, delay has not been our friend in this project. The comments about mistakes really are about creating more delay in the process. So knowing that we were in a position of having to go back to our voters to ask for additional funds to get us across the finish line, another couple of years of funding, Xcel came to the city and suggested a renewed round of negotiations. I will say at this point, Xcel has become a different company. Our effort to continually highlight the importance of this buyer-seller relationship and the importance of energy and achieving community goals has really driven Xcel to become a different company, especially here in Colorado. So when I say it's been worth it, it has been worth it even if we have not created our utility yet. If we ever do, great, but at the same time, we have moved the utility in a pretty significant way, and that's significant. So in terms of our contribution to global climate change. So the partnership agreement really provides that framework for a new way to work together. I want to highlight a really important piece of this. So it identifies specific options that address the gap between Xcel's 80% emissions reduction by 2030. That's where our utility believes they will be, and Boulder's goal of getting to 100% renewable electricity. So again, a lot to read here, but I want to just say that as we negotiated this agreement, there were a lot of parts and pieces that did set us up to be successful and essentially do some of the things that we wanted to do through municipalization, but also set us up in the event that we had to go back to municipalization. So a few of the things that we got into this agreement is an assurance of GHG reductions by 2030 and having Xcel, and this is GHG reductions statewide, not just for the city of Boulder, this is for the state of Colorado. Having these emission check-ins in 2022, 24, and 27, and allowing the city to exit the franchise if they're not hitting those GHG targets. The partnership agreement really facilitates some modernization in our grid planning, facilitates renewable electricity goals, maintains our feasibility on municipalization in the future, allows us to catch up on the undergrounding funds that we didn't have access to during the duration of our municipalization effort, which is roughly $33 million. And I will just kind of turn to this because I know this is important to you all and your listeners. So again, what we really wanted to do is see hard and fast emission reductions. Xcel has said where they believe they will be in 2030. We wanted them to hold themselves accountable for actual CO2 equivalent reductions between now and then. So these are the emission reductions that they agreed to. Again, these are now codified at the state level. They know that they need to hit them, and we wielded our power of municipalization to get them to do that. So it allows us to end the franchise through those GHG reductions in 2025, 2028, but we also have the ability to vote to end the franchise in 2026, 31, and 36 for any reason. So if Xcel is not playing nice, if they are not the partner that we believe they should be, we can go right back to municipalization. Now, here was the important piece is that in that agreement, it also puts a $200 million cap on any condemnation award. That includes acquisition cost, real property interest, going concern, damages to the remainder, and the purchase of 2 existing substations. This is fundamental because there was this threat that Xcel would be able to get all of these additional costs levied against us, and we would break our budget, essentially. Our modeling shows that we know we can be cash positive at 214 million and even more than that, depending on some of the other variables. So this puts a cap on those costs going forward. It also creates an agreement on issues that we were tangled up in around some substation work and any updates to the existing substation interconnection studies and design drawings. So that's big. And it allows us to move forward and not relitigate the discussion back in front of our Public Utilities Commission. So in essence, it actually puts us in a really good place, even further along than we are today or would have been in some sense, because it gives us uncertainty if we go back to municipalization. So I mention this because it is not off the table. Municipalization is not a done deal in Boulder. We are going to take the opportunity over the next couple of years to work with our utility to see if we can push them even further to have a bigger impact at the state level and possibly in the other states that they serve. All right, that was a lot. I am sorry for that. As I mentioned, I've been doing this a long time. I can talk about this a long time, but I want to turn to your questions now, and I see some raised hands already.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Mark.
So in hindsight, basically you use municipalization to get leverage over the utility and to get them to do what you wanted, which is in their interest and everybody's interest, but certainly doesn't resonate well with some of their stockholders. But put that aside. My question is this: could you have gotten the utility to the same place with something other than municipalization?
If I hear your question right, the you in that equation is maybe Boulder, or is that no?
Boulder.
The answer is no. And I say that because we have a long history of working. We are a city that engages very actively at the state legislature. We introduce bills, we get sponsorship in bills, we push the utility through the regulatory and the legislative approach. I don't believe, of course, the utility reacts to markets, they react to the law, but at the same time, I don't believe that they would be where they are today. I say that with a fair amount of certainty.
See.
First and foremost, thank you. This was awesome. Second, not surprising, Boulder, as you mentioned, and Ann Arbor are very, very similar and share very, very complementary goals and objectives in this landscape. I'm wondering, as you kind of think about the way technology has changed since you started, have you explored limited poles and wires options where you really center generation and don't try to fight over owning the distribution network?
Absolutely, yeah. Misty, great question. And I will say that we explored, didn't have time to go into it in my presentation, but we explored all types of options. We looked at community choice energy as kind of muni light. We looked at a non-poles and wires opportunity. We looked at an overbuild, basically replicating the existing distribution system and what the cost might be there. We looked at running transmission on the 230 kV line up to a WAPA line and perhaps trying to connect in that way. And this is part of the antiquated reality in Colorado, and many states face this, right? I mean, it is a regulated monopoly state. We cannot do the things that we want to do because of the regulatory construct. So instead, we started to look at, okay, could we actually do our own generation? Could we think about new opportunities? And at the end of the day, to ensure that we were able to transition to the utility of the future, we realized that we had to own and operate that distribution system. Now, one other key point here is that while we do have a lot of funds for underground, we are exploring, thinking about what reliability in a resilient energy system really looks like. Doesn't mean that you just underground power lines. You can look at pairing storage opportunities. You can look at critical facilities and other ways to meet those energy needs. The expense of putting wires underground is pretty extensive. So we're trying to really use those funds where it makes the most sense. So I use that to say technology exists in a lot of different ways as we pursue our electrification goals, really getting people off of gas and really driving fossil fuels out of our energy supply. I hope that answered your question.
I thought someone else had their hand up. Chuck, did you change your mind?
I'm back. Yeah, sorry. I was actually in Boulder last week fixing my son's solar project on his house. So I wished I would have stopped by, Jonathan, and I would have convinced you to come by and do a feasibility study for us. I'm sure we couldn't steal them away. I have lots of questions. I'm sure we'll have time to catch up with Jonathan later. It's getting late here. I guess the main driver is value contribution. You guys really focused on that. I think that was crucial. You haven't looked at the finish line. You've kind of moved toward the finish line without making changes that were fatal. Keeping the door open, keeping the pressure on. I know the folks at Excel pretty well. I know that they're changing. I believe our utilities in this state will change. I know one is for sure, maybe not the one we want it to, but I think the pressure piece is what's critical. And I think that through our feasibility study, we can show that we're serious. We can show how we're going to demonstrate to DTE that this is important to all of us. And how do we get on the same bus together if we can? And if we can't, we'll set up strategies on how we can move forward. So thank you for your presentation. Very eye-opening for our team, and look forward to future.
Bridget.
Thanks. So I'm not aware that Ann Arbor has a franchise agreement with DTE, does it?
No, for the Foot Act, we have, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
We have a permanent franchise with DTE. And
we can't negotiate our franchise.
That was set up before the Foot Act, so it cannot be, it doesn't end. It's a permanent franchise.
Right. So it seems
like we can't negotiate over that.
It seems like we're lacking two very important levers of power that both Franklin Park and Boulder have. So I don't know, Jonathan, if you can speak to how critical that was and what you think not having that lever would do to our situation.
Can I piggyback on that, please? And that is, given we have a permanent franchise with our IOU, and as I understood the analysis model that you showed, it starts with a load analysis. And the question is, if our utility DTE has a permanent franchise with us and does not want to cooperate with us, what is the chance that we will be able to have a realistic feasibility study done with reasonable inputs? What is our leverage, to use Bridget's point, to be able to have the key inputs that allow us to have outputs that we can go to City Council and the residents of Ann Arbor and say, with reasonable certainty, plus or minus, you name it, or anybody can name it, 10, 20%, not plus or minus a couple 100%, that this feasibility study is somewhat close to the mark.
Commissioners, fabulous questions. I love these questions. Okay, so to the first one, remember that a franchise agreement is a public rights of way agreement. It is not an agreement that looks at your rates, your reliability, your portfolio. Those communities like Boulder and others that have franchises that are typically renewed every 20 years, it creates an opportunity to negotiate. But I will tell you, very few communities actually take that opportunity or know how to negotiate. I think that is a problem. What a great insight in terms of access to viable data. One of the things that we did up front is, first of all, try to use our regulatory power at the PUC to compel Excel to give us data that was necessary to do our analysis. It is just insane to me that we as communities don't have the information from our utility providers about the basic issues around load, customers, peak, all of the things that are so critical to just understand how we use energy in our communities. We, as cities, we are on the backside trying to implement programs, and we don't even know how effective our programs are if our utility is not giving us the data. So one of the things that we did early on is do a baseline analysis. It was part of that early feasibility, and that was a contracted, I think we spent about $60,000 on that. And it was a pretty hefty analysis looking at all of the parts and pieces of our current energy system. They were able to cull all of the existing publicly available data, being able to tease out information and put together a really strong baseline analysis by which we could kick off our feasibility. So at the same time they were doing that, we were getting information from our utility compelled through Public Utility Commission proceedings. So I just point out that that's a really important piece. Know where you're starting from.
Erica.
I want to continue on this question. I think, Bridget, part of your question was also kind of the leverage, kind of where you're at right now as well, in terms of helping to, maybe you don't have that franchise agreement seems to still be on the table in terms of a point of leverage. And so without that, I'm also curious how that might play into kind of stranded costs as you might be thinking about them and projections on that.
I'm not totally getting the connection between the stranded cost and the franchise. And let me just speak a little bit, because stranded cost and going concern get thrown around as these huge specters that will kill any municipalization effort. You saw in that video the Edison Institute playbook to defeat every municipalization attempt. And that is one of the big ones. Like, just throw that out there. That's risk, right? Remember that FERC adopted stranded cost obligation to compensate integrated utilities whose generation assets couldn't be delivered to another paying distribution provider because of the open access requirements to the utilities transmission system. So there are variables that impact the calculation of stranded costs. So revenue stream estimates, competitive market value estimates, length of obligation. You have the ability to influence all of those inputs. And so stranded costs, and as I said earlier, FERC requires the utility to take all steps to eliminate stranded costs. They have to prove that they have done everything to mitigate stranded costs. And they have to prove they can't sell any of that release capacity to other native load customers. So use that to your advantage and understand what the market is of your capacity that would be released. So just something that's really important. In the state of Colorado, I can't speak to Ann Arbor, but I know in Colorado, we have precedent that utilities can't get awarded both stranded cost and going concern. It's got to be one or the other. And so the going concern is just the loss of future profits. And it's very hard for them to just kind of take a number and pick that. So there are some precedent in terms of some of the other types of utilities that exist. I'll just put it that way, not the IOUs, but and it's just not applicable to Xcel Energy as a regulated monopoly. So the franchise, yeah, I mean, of course, Xcel wants to lock up those franchises, but they have, I think, come to the table in a way that we never expected. They want to be good partners. They want to make this work. They actually believe that working, and part of that has to do with new leadership at the company. And it's driven by market for them too. They realize that there is no future in owning and operating coal plants, and they need to figure out how to work more effectively with their communities that now realize have opportunities to move off of the system. So I have to applaud them for that. And they've come to the table in a very sincere and genuine way. And I think that, yeah, the threat of getting back out of our franchise, sure, it's there. Absolutely.
Bridget, did you have another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I still don't think that my question about what our leverage is has been answered, because I'm still seeing that Winter Park and Boulder had points of leverage with franchise. In your case, a franchise agreement ending, and in Winter Park's case, operating agreement that came to an end. And I still don't see a path forward for Ann Arbor without that point, because we would just go to DTE and say, we want our own muni. And they would say, really? Sorry, but you're permanently tied to us.
Commissioner, I now understand your question. I apologize. The leverage is not the franchise. The leverage is losing Boulder as a customer. And I will say we're not a significant or huge amount, but when you look at electricity alone, Xcel is somewhere in the realm of $125 million in revenue just on the electricity. They are also our gas provider. And so looking at the loss of that revenue and profit, that is much more leverage, in my opinion, than the franchise. And you heard Randy say this too, and actually might have been Steve and Paul, the two callers from Boulder, that they saw a domino effect, that as one city leaves and creates the pathway, particularly in Colorado, there were a number of communities that were watching saying, if you can do this, and then there was a pathway through our commission to actually figure out how a city might actually get out of their franchise, because you can get out of your franchise. It's a legal process, but the leverage we had was not the franchise. The leverage was us leaving. The franchise was just the point in time that we started the negotiations. Maybe that didn't fully answer your question, but hopefully a little bit better.
I was just going to say, I think in the context of Michigan, to answer Bridget's question too, is we have the permanent franchise agreement, but it is legal to acquire the assets through eminent domain. So I think you're right in that, like, it seems as though we wouldn't be able to do the exact process that both Boulder and Winter Park were trying to go through, but it's legal to acquire it another way. Whether or not that's financially viable, I think is still up on the table and, through the feasibility study, but that's the way.
No question. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner. We absolutely were using eminent domain. We were using our condemnation power granted by our state constitution to acquire that system. And just to give you an idea of our distribution system, our appraisal and the agreed upon essentially was around $150 million, which sounds like a huge amount of money. But as I mentioned earlier, in your debt service, and you amortize that to 20, 30 years, we looked at a number of ways to amortize that. It was in the margins, believe it or not. It was not a high risk variable. The power supply was much more important.
Can I ask real quickly, was that your estimate or was that Excel's estimate? No, you said Excel was not to exceed 200 million, right?
Well, that was with a number of other additional costs. That wasn't just acquisition costs. So our appraisal early on was under $100 million. Excel, of course, I mean, not unexpected, was closer to 200 million. We came a little bit closer, but again, that price, your appraisals are only used to go into your district court where they value the system and say, okay, city, if you're going to acquire these assets through using your condemnation power, here's what you got to pay, get out your checkbook.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is, you answered the question, is how we deal with this issue of the agreement is part of the feasibility study. So it's going to come down to some sort of a negotiated legal process with a dollar sign attached to it. The feasibility study would determine, but there's no question that the city has legal abilities to use to get the right to move forward, regardless of whether or not they think they have a permanent agreement or not. So that's just a question, or hopefully a very early question that would be answered in any study. Perhaps we could even get that answered before we answer the question of whether or not we have to go to the next step of a feasibility study.
Thanks, Mark. Bridget, another question?
And thank you, Jonathan, for answering all these questions. You mentioned that a lot of your leverage came from other communities watching what you were doing very closely, and Excel fearing that that there would be a domino effect if your muni went through. I'm wondering how actively you worked with those other communities to kind of coordinate this appearance or actual reality of a coalition.
Thanks for the question, Commissioner. Remind me, is this being recorded?
Yes, it is.
I'm kidding. Yeah, I think that was absolutely part of our strategy. So I moved through it pretty quickly, but on the slide where I talked about communications, that was such a critical piece because, getting people to get excited about distribution systems is a bit of a challenge. So you have to paint that vision, and that vision is broader than one community. It's how we can create that model, that replicable model, and where that value shows up. It's not just Boulder, but it's every community thinking about changing circumstances in their energy costs, how important it's going to be to maintain a level of service, address the impacts that we are seeing related to climate and the disruptions that we will see to our energy system. And so part of our campaign of sorts was to talk with other communities so they understood why we were doing it. Now, I have to be clear, this was a very contentious issue. We describe this as the biggest decision our community would ever make. And for a lot of the businesses, this represented a huge amount of risk. And for whatever reason, and I have to totally appreciate everyone's perspective, this is our community's decision to make, not the city's, where they said, oh, we just don't want the city doing this. We don't want them to run our electric utility. We don't trust them. We're trading one monopoly for another monopoly. Sure, we have the PUC, now we have the city council. Businesses, well, I can't imagine that you can run this utility economically and rates are going to increase. All fair concerns, no question. And that's why we continue to do that feasibility and provide as much data out there as possible. That data was always available to every other community, not just in Colorado, but nationally, who have been thinking about this just like yourselves. We said, learn from what we've experienced if you can. We will give you all of our analyses. We will give you all of our models, all of our spreadsheets, all of our documentation, so you can make an informed decision as a community. So yes, that we absolutely worked with those communities. It showed up at the legislature. It showed up at our Public Utilities Commission in terms of continuing to push the utility to be a better utility and be a better partner to their communities that they serve.
Anyone else have a question? Go ahead, Edie.
Just real briefly, Jonathan, thank you again for your time. I know you mentioned that there were a significant number, it sounded like you said more than a dozen working groups. So if you could briefly speak to a little bit of what those working groups covered and what stage they came in, if feasibility study is a little bit too early for that sort of a thing, or if there's a document that you could direct us to that describes this, so we don't have to go into great detail too, but any of those. Thank you.
No, fabulous question. Yes, I would say it's not too early. Partially because we wanted to make this about a community decision, not about the city making a decision. So there were, I believe, 14 working groups that we established early on through the early feasibility. So as I showed you that Prezi, that was just a part of a lot of the details are there. All the spreadsheets are linkable in there. And that was to really to understand and unpack things like power supply. Talking about reliability, what are the indices that we ought to be thinking about? What are the best practices in the industry? Thinking about things like the utility of the future. What would be the programs and services that we should be thinking about offering? Our debt service, thinking about the financials and our bonding capacity. And so we had a financial group, a resources group, a communications group. I'm struggling now. But we do have a link to all of the reports of those working groups, and many of those were finite. They did their work, and then we would bring them back on occasion to test some of the models. Steve and Paul, who called in earlier, were part of a broader group that was a technical team that was more on really just kind of maintaining a high level of policy, a high level view on how we are thinking about municipalization. And, I just have to come back to the fact that we did make some mistakes. The mistakes were in sequencing, again, going to the commission, thinking about assets. We thought our legal interpretation was that we could serve customers outside city limits, and realizing when the utility threw their weight at it, that there was no way we were going to be able to do that. So we had to redesign our separation plan and take it back to our commission. So understanding that sequence is just so critical because it is real money. And the working groups, I will have to admit, some of them flagged those issues early on. They said, we don't think that your legal interpretation of your attorneys is accurate. And we had to just keep moving forward. So I want to acknowledge and honor them for the work that they put in. It was an extraordinary amount of work. I think we had over 150 volunteers over the totality of the project.
I have a few questions and I'll have others think. So you said 14 community groups from staff resources. How many FTE equivalents were you talking about in staff, more or less on average during this period?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well,
obviously it varied a lot over time, but I'm thinking opportunity costs too, or just resource planning.
No, fabulous question. And in fact, we had to put out quarterly reports on our budget to our community, and those showed our actual expenses for the project, and then those ancillary costs, which were time of staff who were like our city attorneys, who are doing other things, and the time devoted to this project. What was the value of that? So we could truly value the amount of money that was spent on this project. Yeah. So early on, around 2010, it really was just a couple of staff, myself, assistant city manager, and then we started building up our team. In 2013, I realized that I only know what I know. My background is not in electric utilities nor creating them. So we went out and said, we need to get the brightest minds in this business. So we, at that time, hired an electric utility development director who had run a utility and gone through a process like this. And so then we started to build our teams. And I will say a lot of the expense is not internal. It's, look, our FERC attorneys are expensive. So any of your attorneys working on, and we had a number of FERC filings, again, out of sequence a bit, but we spent a lot of money in DC working on FERC filings. Our legal support at our Public Utilities Commission, again, very expensive. Turns out electrical engineers, distribution system engineers are pretty expensive, helping design a system. I see Chuck shaking his head. Well, maybe the ones that we got.
Chuck's going to do this all pro bono. That's why he's shaking his head. We got that now.
Perfect.
Right? We got it on tape, no less.
So yes, I would say that its greatest, we had probably 2 or 3 city attorneys sharing some of their time. Our team was roughly 6 employees working on this project. And then, of course, our consultants that were there supporting the staff level work.
Thank you. Second question is, as I understood your framing of stranded costs, if in effect there were no stranded costs, that means that Xcel's energy was going to be used by another customer. So I'm thinking in terms of broader equity concerns. DTE is in the process of building, just got approved from the Michigan Public Services Commission, a 1,100,000 natural gas megawatt natural gas plant. Ann Arbor says, well, there's going to be no stranded costs. DTE says, okay, we agree, but then they're just going to sell all the electricity from that new natural gas plants and the other ones that they want to build, at least another one, to the rest of the territory. So what did Boulder think it was going to accomplish versus what we think we might accomplish in terms of minimizing stranded costs that we might not have to pay, but then pushing that burden on all of DTE's other customers?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. And it's an excellent question. It was a consideration that we had too. So the gradual departure approach that I outlined just briefly was to look at Xcel's resource need. And rather than, so what we were hoping to do is the commissioners would grant approval. And so I issued testimony that laid out this. I'm happy to share it with you. It lays out the mechanics of what this would look like. So essentially, rather than Xcel going out and bidding and developing, either extending existing contracts for natural gas or building a new CT, combustion turbine, to meet that load, what we said is we will release capacity commensurate with your requirements, with your load need. So you say, and it's not going to be smooth, right? So it'd be in kind of some stair steps. So they went to the commission and said, we're going to need 800 megawatts of new capacity. by this year, we need roughly 100 megawatts here, we need 80 there. And so we're going to meet that need with a new CT or that gas turbine. We're just going to extend the contract. We say, hey, hold on, you don't need to do that. You can meet those needs with your existing capacity. We will depart. We're going to buy our capacity on the wholesale market from somebody else. So it's a win-win. That was the thought. Now, the downfall of that is that now Xcel is working hard to replace all of their coal generation and their legacy gas with renewables. And so what we want is as much renewables on the system as possible. So yes, releasing our capacity is good, but also it's not replacing the existing fossils with renewables. So that was a bit of the trade-off that we acknowledged.
Okay, 2 more quick questions, hopefully.
Sure.
You talked about having to do multiple feasibility costs. You heard that there's estimates of a feasibility cost in Ann Arbor of anywhere from 120 to, I heard someone earlier say 175,000, 150, 175,000. Does that seem reasonable for our council member representatives that I think now have dropped off? But I'm just wondering, are we voting on recommending to council to spend roughly $150,000, or realistically, is this going to be something that over a period of years is going to be $300,000, $500,000?
Well, I can only speak from our experience. And I guess if I was answering that question sitting on your commission, I would say this. I would say that you need to do this initial feasibility analysis to understand your options. Will it lead to updating that feasibility analysis? Undoubtedly. But the reality is, I think the bulk of your cost, and to say that range, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. Depends on how you want to go about it. To me, it's really looking at what I said earlier, making sure that you're looking at the value add, really understanding the legal, technical, and financial feasibility components, the legal, really understanding the macro, not just saying, oh, well, you have condemnation power. Well, really understanding what are the possibilities, what is the utility going to do in a response. And that all should be embedded in your feasibility so you understand what you're up against. So I think that range is completely fair and reasonable. Will you need to put more money later on as things change, as costs change? Probably so.
Okay, great. That's helpful. And then simply, if there's anything else, like my question to Randy earlier, how do we get the biggest bang for the resources that we put in, not only the dollars, but staff time and everything else to get a really good feasibility study? Is there a vendor that you would recommend? Is there a playbook that you know of? How do we initiate this process so that we don't say at the end of this, oh shit, we missed X and Y and Z?
Well, I think you're doing one of those things. You're talking to communities that have kind of gone through this, and a vendor, I can share with you, and I'll share it with Missy also, if that's helpful, a number of the vendors that we use for parts and pieces of our feasibility.
Right.
Don't underestimate, you have an extraordinary staff team. I will just say that. You have an extraordinary staff team that is capable of and I shouldn't say this, Missy's going to kill me to say that I'm going to put this on her work plan, but managing parts and pieces of the feasibility, I think when we thought about a playbook, as you asked, there isn't one that we saw that really kind of matched up with what we were trying to understand. So we built it. We did it ourselves. Those parts and pieces are out there. Doing a load model is not hard. Using Homer or a similar software is not hard. Using DPL, which was a software decision tree analysis, or Monte Carlo, not hard. We did hire someone to stitch those together because, again, you needed one model to feed to the next model to the next, so you have an output. That financial analysis, we hired one of our consultants to build that financial tool later on. That was a pretty reasonable cost, I think roughly $25,000. And that was a very, very robust tool. So I think you start to build some momentum and consultants will want to participate. They'll want to work on this project.
Thank you. I'm done. Bridget and Mark.
Yeah, you mentioned that, sorry, my brain is turning into mush. You mentioned that one of the ingredients for getting Excel to get to the concessions that you wanted was that they had a change in leadership towards more progressive, I guess, upper management. And I'm curious if you can comment as to whether that happened as a result of this pressure that Boulder placed on the company, or if it was something just organically happening at that company that coincidentally helped with this negotiation.
I'll try to make this quick. I think it's both. I think there is a macro and a micro. The macro, of course, are the global stressors on utilities. We all know that. We don't need to get into that. The market that is really driving those utilities that are vertically integrated to really rethink their business model. How are they going to remain solvent in this? I mean, if we look back 5 years, just think this. It's just mind blowing as I think about this. How rapidly the energy system has changed in the last 5 years, much less 10 years. It is extraordinary. So yes, those macro pressures in terms of regulation and policy and public pressure, no doubt has shifted the utility. We're seeing this in every utility start to think about, how do we pivot? Xcel is doing it, and now we've seen other utilities in Colorado saying, oh gosh, well, we got to get to 100%. So how quickly can we do it? How do we get out of these legacy assets, our coal units and our gas units? How do we do that? How do we become more nimble? The micro, I can point you to public statements by the company who have said Boulder has driven them to be a better company. And I take great pride in that. I think our community takes great pride in that. Many people believe we were absolutely nuts to think about municipalization. The amount of money that we spent, I will just tell you, over the duration, this is going to be a shocking number. We spent around $20 million. It sounds like a huge amount of money over a decade. But I have to reflect back to the question that I posed at the beginning, which was it worth it? I believe yes, because we have had that impact on our utility, which has such an impact on the state, has an impact on all of the states in which that utility functions. So I have to believe that every dollar was leveraged in a way that really drives innovation and addressing this global crisis that we are all facing.
Jonathan, was those out-of-pocket costs or also your FTE costs?
Those were both.
Both, good.
Both.
Art, Bridget, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Michigan has 40 municipal utilities and a fairly robust Michigan Municipal Electric Utility Association. My question is this: does Colorado have an association, and were they any help to you at all in this?
Yes and yes. The help, I'll just put it this way. So our municipal utility association in Colorado, the entire state is going through a transition and has. And I think we've come out the other side, largely driven by very, very progressive elected leadership at the state level. We have been predominantly a fossil fuel-based state. A lot of oil and gas exploration, a lot of coal. That has changed dramatically in the past decade. The reason that I raise that is that our association, it was not really equipped to help us think about municipalization for the purposes that we were looking to municipalize. So in terms of the mechanics, in terms of how to operate a utility, giving us thoughts on how to set up a utility and operate it, looking at our reserves, how we would have spending and operating reserves, how we would have some of the other issues around our open access transmission tariff, setting that up. They were extremely helpful. They helped connect us to resources. APPA was extremely helpful. And then just reaching out to existing authorities on this. Jefferson County PUD, Austin Energy, lots and lots of smart people to help us kind of test, are we doing the right thing? Can you break our model? Get in there and break it, because if it's wrong, we need to know that it's wrong. So we actually hired a firm out of North Carolina with that intent. And we as staff did not. We asked our city manager to hire them. We didn't want to be involved. We turned it all over to them and said, tell us the fatal flaws and tell us that we're idiots. That's fine. We're okay. And in the video I showed you, the one person that mentioned that, who said that we had a third-party verifier, Sam Weaver, he's actually now our mayor. So he was a firm believer in public power, and that was a platform he ran on.
Excellent. Well, Jonathan, thanks again so much for spending your evening with us. It's another evening where you've missed your dinner with your significant others, and I'm sure it's one of many, but we really appreciate it very much. And if we're ever out in Boulder, then one of us will take you out for a beer or more.
But I would love it. I applaud all of you for doing this hard work. You're doing it the right way. I will just conclude by saying it will be hard. And no matter the outcome, it will be worth it. Whether you choose as a community to municipalize, it creates a level of literacy that is so important for your community to understand the choices and where you need to go next. So just so grateful for the work that you're doing there. We're all in this together. Anything I can do to be helpful, please let me know.
Great. Well, certainly speaking for me, and I think for all of us, this was incredibly helpful. Both your and Randy's presentations. Thanks very much again.
And
Missy,
by the
any
way,
closing comments from your side?
John, by the way, Lone Pine Brewery out in Boulder is a pretty fine establishment.
We have a lot of them.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Missy, any closing comments from your side?
Just a huge thank you for everything you do. And we often say in our office, we're about 10 years behind Boulder, but I look forward to catching up with you soon. In both ways, both cordially and in our clean energy goal.
Great. Good night, Jonathan.